What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel. I am so honored today to be able to speak with Dr. Fred Provenza about the insights that he has gained over 40 years of research about the innate nutritional wisdom of animals and the connection to humans. So, Dr. Fred Provenza is currently a professor of emeritus in behavioral ecology in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University. So he was a ranch manager for 7 years before earning his master's and PhD in range science. And then he was a faculty member in range science from 1982 through 2009. So, for the last 30 years, he's helped produce groundbreaking research to lay the foundations for behavioral based management of landscapes, which has had implications in a number of fields, such as ruminant and human nutrition, animal welfare, biopsychology, and landscape restoration. So, Dr. Provenza has over 250 publications in peer reviewed journals and books, and he's been an invited speaker at over 300 international conferences. So, he is a busy guy, and I really appreciate the time he took to chat with me today. So, today we chatted about animals' inner wisdom, how they know instinctively what to eat, how much to eat, what they're deficient in, and we really cover three main pillars that Dr. Provenza has observed throughout his research career. And then we talk about the parallels in human health and how, as humans, we've really lost touch with a lot of this nutritional wisdom. So before we dive into the conversation, I'll bring up a brief quote from one of his recent research papers. You guys should definitely check it out. It says, "People in developed societies have lost the wisdom that comes from living closely with nature. In a vivid illustration of this mass delusion, some societies are now in the midst of convincing themselves that plant-based faux meat is better than the real thing, and that a nature is feeble-minded nitwit compared to the time-tested wisdom of Silicon Valley technologies." So kind of this whole idea that we are in some way superior to nature and we can outsmart nature with technology. So make sure you guys stick around to the end. I come back on and just discuss a few more things that we didn't really have time to go into depth and ponder and question about. So I hope you guys enjoy. All right, Dr. Provenza, thank you so much for joining me today. We were just discussing offline about how we both enjoy watching our chickens. We learn so much from them, and then it's also stress relieving. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about some of the bigger picture ideas that you bring up in your book, Nourishment, and then in your most recent paper, We Are the Earth and the Earth is Us, How Palates Link Foodscapes, Landscapes, Heartscapes, and Thoughtscapes. And I just love in both of these, you bring up examples that you found from watching and observing animals, such as how we're doing with our chickens throughout your years of research. And then you do a great job connecting these insights back to humans. And so I would say your kind of bigger picture, as far zoomed out as we can get, is our food and nutritional wisdom system is kind of broken. Can you talk briefly about some of the insights that you've gained from your 40 or so years in research studying the innate nutritional wisdom in animals?
Well, first, Ashley, just a word to say how grateful and wonderful it is to be with you. Really looking forward to our conversation today. And with regard to the question that you're asking, go back just a little bit in time to, as you say, observations, watching animals do different things, and go back to the years when about 45 years ago down in southern Utah, watching goats forage on blackbrush, and they weren't doing any of the things we thought they should do. They didn't want to eat the most nutritious parts of the blackbrush plant, the new growth that's higher in energy, protein, minerals, and so forth. And some in one pasture, they were eating wood rat houses. So all that was incredibly intriguing to me is to, well, why are they doing that? And I don't know why, but I didn't think they were just crazy. I thought there was more to it than that. And so when I finished the grad school days and started working at Utah State University, I had really the opportunity to study behavior of animals and trying to look at food and habitat selection. And really, there are three things that came out of that last 40 years or so of research related to your question. I think more and more that there are three legs to this stool of nutritional wisdom. And if we break any one of those legs, whether it's for ourselves or for the animals that are in our care, then you can't see nutritional wisdom manifest. And the first would be the availability of alternative forages. Um, the more we restrict ourselves and the animals in our care in terms of the choices they can make, for instance, for livestock, when we put them on a monoculture of grass where there's not much choice, sure, the plant may be really nutritious, but that's the only choice. We put them in a box. When we feed them total mixed rations in confinement, we really put them in a box. And that's not to say that great minds haven't done a great deal from a nutritional standpoint to help us to understand human and livestock nutrition. It's not discrediting that, but it's simply saying that no two individuals on this planet have ever been or ever will be alike. We know that from our standpoint. Bloodhound can track us by our odors. We can each be identified by our fingerprints. When you look inside, it's the same thing in terms of form and function. And that gets expressed through the unique choices that each animal will make. So choice and ability to choose, availability of alternatives is just fundamentally important for animals to be able to not only meet their needs for nutrients, but to self-medicate. So that would be kind of the first thing I would say. The next
Can we
thing,
dive into that one a little bit more?
yes, we can.
Okay, so some of the things that I learned from your book about this whole idea of like, we kind of think that we have it all figured out sometimes, and we can just give these animals this like average set of nutrients. So it's sufficient for the average animal to give them this feed or this total mixed ration, TMR, or have them on this monoculture field. And so I think, can we talk about some of the potential repercussions and negative consequences of that? I think one of them is like a loss of efficiency. So some animals do not gain weight as fast. Some animals gain weight faster. They have nutritional deficiencies. There's like stress in the animal. What are some of the like consequences of these type of restricted feedings?
You're doing a great job of talking about some of those. You really are. Everything that you mentioned from efficiency, and it brings to mind, let's just stay on efficiency for a minute. Some studies we did years ago with both sheep and with cattle. Let me speak about the cattle one because I think it so makes the point. We had cattle that we were finishing. We had them on finishing rations. And one group of cattle was fed a total mixed ration. The other group was simply given a choice of the 4 or 5 ingredients that were in that total mixed ration. And then we looked at food intake, average daily gain, and then after we slaughtered them, we looked at carcass characteristics and so forth. And what we found was that the animals given a choice ate less food and less of the most expensive ingredients than the animals on the total mixed ration, which suggests, as you were saying, and we could develop this more, but that animals will overeat, overingest to try to meet needs for nutrients in limited supply. There's in the human obesity literature, there's a hypothesis that's been developed by insect ecologists, actually, which is kind of interesting, but it's called the protein leverage hypothesis. And that's exactly what they're saying for humans. As one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons they argue that we have such an issue with obesity nowadays is that protein is in the diet in limited amounts, less than what we need in terms of quality and quantity. So we're over ingesting energy to meet needs for protein. That's the same thing that we're seeing in part on the cattle. But so there was an efficiency, as you say, that was lost, and that meant dollars. It cost way less to finish animals if you simply gave them a choice than if they were on the total mixed ration. It was very interesting too, as relates to the average individual. We were working with a nutritionist, and he had formulated the ration to meet the needs of the average individual in the group, and he did that. But when we looked at the individuals that were offered a choice, and let's take protein energy ratios, for instance. When we calculated those, some animals were above his line, some were below, no animal was on the line. But if we averaged all of the animals in that group, they came right exactly where Randy had formulated the ration, but there was no individual. And so what we saw was no two individuals selected the same combination of foods ever, and no individual selected the same food from day to day, but they all selected foods that that met their individual, their own body's needs, given the fairly restricted choice that we gave them. A couple of different grains that were in the ration and some silage and alfalfa and so forth.
Yeah, and it's almost obvious the connection with humans, right? So in the animals, we're confining them to this like specific feed that has a set amount of nutrients, micronutrients, and just assuming that that's going to work for every animal. We see this happening in the human sphere with all these processed foods. Like we're giving them this preset, prepackaged food. And like you said, people over consume food to reach their protein requirement. I would also add to that they're over consuming food to reach their micronutrient content, because a lot of our food has reduced in micronutrients from conventional agriculture practices. So we're left with this obese and malnourished nation. And the parallels in these like concepts with animals and humans are like, it's almost obvious, and it's occurring roughly at the same time, like right after the World War II and the increase in industrial agriculture. It's unfortunate to see, and I think that this connection is a big thing that you bring up in your writings about like how we just lost touch with nutritional wisdom, and instead we're basing all of these decisions based on like what we deem to be the average needs and the average nutritional rules, which are changing year to year. Saturated fat was good, animals were good, now it's bad. And so there's all these disconnects and parallels based on this like average assumption for animals and humans.
Oh, absolutely. Well said, Ashley. And it becomes incredibly confusing for us all, right? I mean, and one can realize, and we'll talk about this next leg of the stool in a minute, but this whole flavor feedback, metabolically driven feedbacks, that's a next really important leg of the stool. That's happening at a non-cognitive level. I often ask people when I'm giving a talk, how many of you are thinking about which enzymes to release to digest the meal you just ate? And people laugh, and some will raise their hands just to tease, but we don't do that. The same is true of this feedback. But a key point is that those non-cognitive, intuitive, synthetic part of our being can be overridden by the cognitive, rational, analytical part. So if we're hearing all the time, eggs are horrible for you, eggs are horrible for you, you're going to die if you eat eggs or fat or meat or whatever it is, that does influence us, and it'll influence the choices that we make and the way that we even come to perceive things. That it's a way that the system gets hijacked. And so then you try to think, what is it even that my body would want to eat? It becomes very confusing. There's no question. And I think people finally just throw their hands up sometimes and say, I'll eat whatever. But the problem, then we're left in the hands of the food industry and the processed foods. And just as you're saying, and I totally agree with you on micronutrients too, and if you think about then when we enrich and fortify processed foods with a little bit of what we need, oh my gosh, that can really set you up to overeat. I'll tell one more story. You can cut it if you want, but it's by a good friend. His name's Doc Holliday, and he was one of the first what you would call holistic veterinarians, way back in the day, before anybody was even using those terms or talking about that. He was practicing that. And he has a story in a book that he wrote, and he told me this story years ago, and I've used it all the time, about working with a dairy. I think it was in Iowa. It was early on in his career. And the dairy producer that he was working with was having two issues. One, just before they were due to calve, his replacement heifers were boarding fetuses. And two, they were eating 2 pounds of a mixed mineral per head per day. That's mixed mineral block. That's a huge, huge amount. That's way, way over consuming. And so, then they figure, they go in to try to figure out, they sent the animals in for autopsy and so forth. And the note that they got back said that the animals had starved to death. They died of starvation. He said, "Geez, that really took them aback. I mean, malnutrition, one thing, but they starved to death." So he raises all these interesting things. What's happening, though, is simply that the food that they're offering is not meeting needs. And why are the animals starving? They don't want to eat it anymore. That's one of the things that animals do. If they're on a diet that really isn't working, they form an aversion to that diet. It becomes like a toxin. So they were, in fact, starving. But then the mineral part of it, why ingesting so much? Well, they had available at that time a cafeteria mineral program where you could offer animals free choice minerals. And so the dairy farmer, Carl, decided to take up this program. And what he observed then, as he started to offer free choice, was that the animals were just eating the zinc like mad. They would even attack him when he was carrying the zinc across the thing. Terry, he has a story, Terry ripping the bag out of his arms, eating all the zinc, the mud and muck. And for several days they did that. Well, what happened then was that they quit having any problems with the replacements, and everything straightened out. Well, what they figured was that these animals were suffering from a severe zinc deficiency. When they had the choice to be able to self-select that, they did it, and all the issues went away. But the idea of over ingesting, why are they eating 2 pounds of that mixed mineral? It comes back, it's a long story, but it winds right back to what we're talking about. And then you think of that in relation to the human diet and some of what we've done, maybe not even deliberately, but inadvertently, we've really set ourselves up for some horrible outcomes, huh?
Yeah. And so along those lines, some people have recognized this like reduction in mineral intake from our diets. And so then the supplement industry has grown insanely, right? One thing that you really bring up that I appreciated was when animals consume a lot of a nutrient. So let's say that there's like a forced amount of minerals in a specific feed or a total mixed ration TMR, they then tend to avoid that nutrient in nature. And you make the parallel to humans where we are downing some supplements like multivitamins and really high doses of zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D. And then a consequence of that is we then avoid those minerals and nutrients naturally in our food. And so you bring up this, like, again, nutritional wisdom where we're over ingesting these supplements, and that's having repercussions on our food choices. We then tend to avoid these healthy foods that contain them naturally because we're just like over ingesting some of these multivitamins and supplements and things.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Ashley. I can't help but think you've really done your homework for this interview. I want to compliment you because you're getting below the surface on all of those things, and we showed that over and over again, whether it was for dairy cows, how much protein you fed in the barn would influence which plant species and which plant parts they'd eat when they went out on pasture. On rangelands, we saw those same kind of things, and it relates not only to the so-called primary compounds, energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, those sort of things, but all these secondary compounds that we got inadvertently studying 45 years ago with the goats, and then it turned out to be a major area of study. But one thing to mention in relation to that, there's a study published with goats that shows that if you deworm them with a deworming medication of one sort or another, that can also change their food selection away from plants that they can use to self-medicate. For instance, tannin-containing plants. There's a decent literature out there to show that animals can learn to self-medicate with tannins to reduce internal parasite loads when they're high, and that when those loads are low, they'll not eat so much of the tannin-containing plants. We showed that in studies we were doing, and this research was showing that with free-ranging animals. So there are just a lot of things that none of us had ever thought about until you really start to pay attention to animals. And I think what we did that was really helpful, we always ask the animal the question. We set up the studies in a way so we were asking the animal the question, and then we were trying to learn from them, set it up carefully, but ask them the question rather than use this approach where we're dictating what choices the animals. I don't know if that's making sense, but it's that approach of ask the animals the question and then see what they tell you in response to that, and it just leads you down all these different paths that you never imagined were there, you know.
Yeah.
So we talked about one leg of the stool, and really let's talk about that flavor feedback leg of the stool that we alluded to just briefly, and then we can talk about that third kind of transgenerational, maternal, the link to the landscape.
I have a lot of notes for that. So let's just bring up those three stools really quickly. So the first one, which we already
The first one is the availability of alternative foods, which we've been talking about, how important that is, the alternatives available to animals. And then we really went into some nice discussion of implications of that for humans and animals. Then the second leg is this flavor feedback, these metabolically influenced changes in liking for food. And then the third is the transgenerational linkages to landscape. So those are the three legs of the stool. And we've really broken all three of those.
Okay,
and again, it's not to be like it's not meant to be, when I say that, like in some, I think we all do the best we can at each stage of our thinking. And I know there's, weaknesses and everything I'm saying too, but it is just to reflect, huh? We're having a conversation. So that second leg of the stool, the second leg was the one that absolutely blew my mind when we started into that research. And I'll tell you a couple of little stories that lead into how we got to that. And again, if it's too long, you can cut this stuff, but it illustrates so many points. So, when we first started to think about feedback and this idea of feedback, it was from reading studies that some other people had done. The rat literature, where they've been doing these kind of studies for forever. So we were thinking, well, maybe ruminants are just big rats in a way, So let's see if they respond to some of this. And so we were working with this compound called lithium chloride, which used to be used as a substitute for table salt in humans. Now it's used to treat manic depression. And what I'm going to say next is true for any compound, whether it's a nutrient or whatever. It's like Paracelsus said, everything's a toxin. It all depends on the dose. And so if you give animals a little bit of a high dose of lithium chloride, it causes nausea in them, and that causes food aversions. They don't like the food. So we were starting to study that and say, oh my gosh, look, if we offer barley and we follow that with a dose of lithium chloride, the next day the lambs don't want to eat much barley. And so, but what was really, we weren't linking that with that's happening in the real world until we were doing all these studies with goats. And I mentioned it at the first that they didn't want to eat the new growth. We were using goats to prune blackbrush to stimulate new growth because it was higher in nutrients. And we thought, well, this will be a really good thing for those rangelands in southern Utah. But come to find out, most of the goats, going back to that individuality, 80% don't want to touch that new growth. 20%, they love it, but 80% don't. So we were trying to figure out what's going on, and we were working with chemists in Alaska, natural products chemists, and we were doing what are referred to as bioassays. So you go in there, you look at these different fractions, and you look at the secondary compounds, then you extract them, purify them, put them on chow, and see if the animals will eat the chow. And so we've been doing these bioassays, and they take a huge amount of time and effort. And nothing was showing up as deterrent. And so we finally got to the methanol extractables, and they said, well, it's loaded with a condensed tannin. We haven't seen condensed tannins be too deterrent, but that's all that's left. So we do these weeks and weeks. Beth Burt, my colleague, was doing all these extractions and purifications. We finally get enough of this to run some trials, and it's worth gold to us at this point. It's, we've spent so much time and energy clipping the current season's growth, extracting, purifying, and so forth. So we have the goats out there at Green Canyon. We have the chow, and we put this methanol extractable condensed tannin on the chow. And it's early in the morning, it's in the winter, it's very cold. We offered the chow to these 20 goats. They eat every bit of it, every last bit of it. And we're thinking, what's going on? I remember we walked in that outside there and in that cold building, and we were just, the chemist, Tom Clausen, told us this has to be it. We were really totally puzzled. And we didn't have that much of this tannin to run days and days and days of trials. And so we finally decided, well, all we can do is feed it again tomorrow. Fed it the next day, none of the goats wanted to eat it. And the light bulb came on. It's like, oh my gosh, here we're looking at sheep with lithium, but we never, ever thought that this is what's happening with real live plants on landscapes. That was the aha moment for us. And so that led us into really 30 years of research looking at this feedback. So what is feedback? Feedback is coming from cells and organ systems, including the microbiome, in response to food. If you realize that each of the organ systems has its own needs, right? Not only everybody's focused on the microbiome, which it's important, but then we forget, well, you have a liver, you have heart, you have lungs, you have a brain, and they each have their needs, and they're having a say in it. And the say is through these hormones, neurotransmitters, peptides. That's how that the body's feeding back to alter liking for the flavor of food. That's what's happening. So our experiences of the taste and odor, I like it, I don't like it, but we don't realize there's all this tremendous kind of complexity that's feeding back to change our liking for the food. So that's the second leg of the stool, and it's absolutely linked with nutritional wisdom and the needs of all the organ systems of the body. And we did studies with energy. We started with energy because we figured if feedback from energy doesn't work, then it won't work from a nutrient standpoint. And of course, you can condition incredibly strong and that's what the processed food industry actually has learned to do. Take kind of novel flavors, or create flavors that are based on foods we know, follow that with a blast of energy, and you condition really strong preferences with processed foods. That's what's happened. But we started with energy, then went to protein, then did a lot with protein to energy ratios, rates at which they ferment relative to one another. All the time, these animals are so sensitive to that, so rather than being just kind of walking compost heaps that are out of touch, they're very in touch. Then we went on to minerals, and that's the work where we were showing, they can learn to self-select a variety of minerals. And colleagues in Australia went on to work with vitamins like vitamin E. And so, there's a really huge literature now on feedback, and then all these secondary compounds as well. And to learn that, at low doses, they can condition preferences like anything. At high doses, they can condition aversion. So, that whole idea of these feedbacks, it becomes very important link to how animals do that.
Yeah. So if I can try to summarize that study that you had with the goats, a lot of people don't realize that there's kind of more to eating than like our hunger signals. So hunger signals are important, but then there's this like these processes happening in the background. You call it post-ingestive feedback. So our body is responding to the foods that we consumed. And the insights that you gained from your goat study were that one day they loved this tannin-rich food. Then the next day they didn't touch it. And the goats associated that plant with a post-ingestive feedback of some negative symptom, like they had some amount of toxic load from consuming those plants with the tannins, and they recognized that. And the next day they said, no, I don't need any more of that because I had those symptoms. And so these animals have this incredible ability to understand when they've reached a toxic load. And so that way they can consume different plants around these fields, pastures, whatever. So that's why it's important to give them this variety of food, not these monoculture pastures. One note that I have written down that you mentioned in your book is that we have more signals from our gut to our brain than from our brain to our gut. And so I think that really that does a good job summarizing like how many complex signals and systems are responding to the food that we consume that we have no idea goes on. And then you bring up the connection with the humans where food, big business, food companies, they recognize this, they understand this. And so then they create these foods that have these similar tastes, similar preferences that we view as safe. So like, for example, cherry flavor, that's a safe flavor, right? Okay, let's now inject that in these energy rich foods because then people associate them as safe. I don't have any negative symptoms. This is comfortable. This is natural. But it's furthest from natural. You wrote something in the book that there's like, we now on average have like over 600 like what is the right word, flavor, like natural flavorings that food companies now put into food. And I really think it goes back to this post-ingestive feedback of like training us humans that this is the food that we should be consuming when it's not.
That's a great summary, Ashley. Again, I compliment you for you really have done your homework relative to this, and I, over the years, until I wrote Nourishment, we just focused on the animals that we were studying. And I always was thinking about humans in the background, but hadn't gotten into the human literature. And, it was so interesting then to compare and contrast. But I wanted to say that I had participated in many, many conferences over the years where everything from insects to humans, we were all there, all of us scientists studying these. And I have to say some of the most interesting talks were by people from the food industry, because we all knew the same ideas and concepts and principles and processes. We were all on top of that. But it's just the audiences that we were targeting. And I used to think, nobody really cares about a goat or a sheep or a cow, but the money is in the human part. They know us better than we know ourselves,
Yeah.
and nothing is left to chance either, guarantee you that.
Yeah.
So it's a no wonder. And again, it's maybe not to blame. I don't know that anybody saw everything that was coming down the pike with this, but we're really in a mess now, huh? And it then links in with that third leg of the stool that when you want, we can go there, but these transgenerational linkages and the role of grandmother and mother and what the offspring do and become, that it really gets to be quite a challenging situation, I think.
Yeah, let's move on to that third leg of the stool, the importance of passing on nutritional wisdom from generation to generation. So what are some of the insights that you have gained there from your research?
Well, again, and it goes back to the goats and just spending time out there like we started, it's just spending time with animals and watching them and thinking about them. And, when I finished the work with the goats, I thought I would really like to study how experiences early in life influence what these animals do. And I remember visiting with my major professor when I was finished, got my PhD, and he said, yeah, could be neat to do a study and just try to figure out to what degree is this genetic and to what degree is it learned, and it was like, well, and we were both naive. And they said, you could do one study, and it ended up being a lifetime of studies. It wasn't one study, and it started with just very simple things related to both food and habitat selection. We were working on both. So, if mom's eating a particular food, does that influence what her offspring do? And it was so easy to show that what mom's if mom eats a particular food and avoids another food, we were setting up studies where we would train mothers to eat, for instance, carrageenan and don't eat Russian olive or whatever it is, doesn't matter. And we'd train them not to eat it with an overdose of lithium chloride. We just let them eat the other one. So mom would have really, she'd go out and she'd strongly avoid this plant, eat the other ones. Then we'd let the lambs go out with her. And it was just so obvious. They would go right with her, do what she did. And then once you took mom out of the pictures, they just go and do what they did with mom, you know, and it's not that they were little robots forever, but it was so easy to show that. And then we thought, well, geez, you know, milk is also a cue. And so we were doing work on mother's milk and the flavors that mom's food get into her milk. And does that influence preference? And it does. And then we started all this in utero work, because then we thought, well, you know, we don't even know this world about in the womb. And we were reading really neat papers by physiologists who were talking about the fetal taste system and showing that it's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So flavors that get into mom's amniotic fluid are already alerting the young fetus to cues of what mom's eats. And so she's eating foods, flavors are there. The fetus is getting reinforced by nutrients that mom's ingesting right into its body. So you're already conditioning preferences. And that in utero work was really, really, really amazing to see the profound influence that could have, not only immediately after birth, but for, I'm thinking of one study I'll just mention briefly with cattle. We were really working with ranchers to look at what are the costs involved in ranching, and a lot of that in the West, and many places actually, is feeding hay in the winter. You have to irrigate, cut, bale, haul hay, and feed all the machinery. It's a great expense. So there were people we were working with saying, we want to get out of that. We want to get out of all that business, because that'll hugely cut the costs. And in cases where they could have animals that were wintering out, then wintering on rangeland, the forages are mature. They're not great quality at that point in time, but they can provide a winter ration, especially if animals are in earlier stages of pregnancy and so forth. So we were doing this in utero work with poor quality forages and showing that an animal that had been exposed in the womb to poor quality forage not only ate more of that forage, but they digested that forage better. And so they grew better than animals that had never had that particular experience. That's just one of many, many studies. But, you know, it shows then how animals can get functionally linked to a landscape through experiences. And it also shows too, it fit with some of the programs that some of the ranchers we were working with were developing and promoting, that, you know, if you want to cut costs, think about natural systems and how they work, and think about, when do deer and elk have their babies? They have them in sync with when all the green forage is coming, right? So they're not having their babies in the middle of winter, because that's a great expense. They couldn't make it that way. And they could, lactation, huge demands for milk production. The fetus has all these demands. So when they move to that, then this wintering animals on poor quality forages starts to make a lot of sense. And having animals that you keep as replacements that have been, their mother has taught them in the womb, all that starts to make sense economically, ecologically, and so forth.
Yeah, it just seems like that's a big part of nutritional wisdom, this learning eating behaviors from mothers. And I feel like it's something that we don't really do a good job with in humans these days. I'm going to read a passage from your book. You mentioned, as with livestock, human learnings begin in utero, as the flavors of substances the mother eats or inhales are transferred into amniotic fluid to be savored by her fetus. After birth, humans learn about foods through the flavors transferred in mother's milk. Amniotic fluid and breast milk share flavor profiles with foods the mother eats. In humans, the flavor of breast milk varies from one mother to another and from one day to the next, depending on the foods eaten in a meal. When mother eats a variety of food, breastfeeding, unlike monotonous formula feeding, can provide an infant with a rich source of sensory variety. And so I feel like that's an insight that you really gain from watching the animals. But are we almost doomed from the start these days as humans? Because you see so many crappy diets and so many mothers are resorting to formulas. It just seems like from the start, we're not passing on nutritional wisdom to the next generation.
Honest to goodness, we've totally broken those links. And there is a really rich literature out there on human beings related to that topic. And I often think of my friend Julie Manella, who worked at the Manella Institute of Chemical Senses, and she did some wonderful work. And it's not to just focus on Julie. Many people did, but I often think of Julie, and I think of when I would be listening to NPR or something years ago on the radio, and they'd start to talk about this. I knew the next thing we were going to say was, and now we're here with Julie Manella, and she's going to tell us about this study that she did. It's so true, but it's frightening. And I haven't thought about the infant formulas and breast milk for some time. So you're reading that just brings all that back. That every time I read about that, I just think how we've so broken all those linkages. And I do have some friends though, and it's really neat to see. There's a lady named Clara Davis, and you know about her because you're so on top of all this. Actually, it's amazingly impressive. But about a century ago, Clara was doing studies with orphans given up for adoption, and she had, I think, 15 orphans that she worked with over a 6-year period, if I'm remembering correctly. And what they were doing was offering these orphans seasonally available wholesome foods. I think there were about 34 different foods, and they would simply offer them a choice of the different foods. And allow them to eat whatever they wanted, and they were recording all this. Can you imagine that for 15 infants, day after day, 365 for 6 years? They enormous.
We should dive into some of those food options though, because I think a lot of people would think that they're crazy options, but they're real wholesome food, like bone marrow. There was liver given options, fruit. I forgot some of the other things, but really nutrient dense whole food sources that like kids just don't get access to these days. And so it goes back to that freedom of choice versus a preset formula or food. So sorry, return. So these kids.
No, that's perfect. That's good, because you wouldn't. I mean, you look at brains and some of the things that were on that list, many of us would find revolting. But the kids, like she said, there was no indication that they innately knew what and what not to eat. Everything went in their mouth at first, right? Even the napkins and the whatever was on the in front of them, they tried it all. But then I remember she said, given a little bit of time, each child would start to hone in on what worked for it. And it's just like what we were talking about when we were offering those cattle on either a TMR or the choice of ingredients. She said, and when we published our work on that, I had not read anything that Clara Davis had written. I say that because it's like we plagiarized her work, And it was a Canadian author, Mark Shaxter, who wrote The Dorito Effect, who said, have you read any of hers? I said, no. He said, he sent some papers. And it's like, oh my gosh. Because she said, what did they see? No two kids ever selected the same combination of foods. No child ever selected the same foods from day to day. But as the pediatricians who were doing all the studies on the kids found, they each selected a diet that they never saw a healthier group of kids, So it was the same thing as the cows as with the humans, which you would expect, I think. But it was just amazing to read her work and to read what she was saying. And now there are parents I know that have made it a point to offer their kids choices of wholesome foods and let them kind of guide the way, not just simply dictate. And it's neat to see that. I think we would have done more of that. Not that we didn't do that when our kids were growing up, but I think it would have certainly been much more on our minds had we thought about that then. But now, like you say, oh my gosh, you have mothers who are overweight or obese and eating these ultra processed diets. So that's what the poor fetus is learning in the womb. And already some can be born pre-diabetic, and their organ systems. And we did some work on this, and there's been much more, this whole area of epigenetics and gene expression, genes being expressed as a function of these experiences. We were showing that those kind of changes were occurring as a result of in utero experiences. And then you look in the human literature, and there's studies that are showing those sort of things, what's happening with the pancreas and the liver, and so all the organ systems of the body. So it is a frightening thing to think about. If you're, and you see all the young people that are really, really heavy nowadays, and if you look back 70 years or so, we were so skinny. We were all, I mean, we were skinny as rails as people. When you look at those old pictures or old, World War II kind of things that I'm thinking about right now, everybody was so thin. And now it's just night and day difference.
It's our experiences at a young age have such a profound impact on our health and our choices the rest of our life. Just to like really bring this point home, I love the example that you gave of Claire's heart transplant. So you can talk a little bit more about this experience, but essentially it goes back to this idea of like cellular memory and developing these food preferences based on these post-ingestive feedback and this experience at birth. I believe this woman named Claire later in life got a heart transplant. And after she got that transplant, her food preferences completely changed. And it's almost like she downloaded the heart donor's food preferences. Am I getting that story correct?
Oh, again, perfect. Actually, and I find that absolutely fascinating. Yeah, Claire Sylvia books A Change of Heart. And she got heart and lung transplant both, as I recall. But it's the very point that you're making. And then, she was one of the first people to ever have that done. So it was back in the day when it was very unusual. And so the press was very interested. And I remember they were interviewing her. She talks about this in the book. Just before she was to be released from the hospital, she'd been on an exercise machine, if I recall correctly. And at the end of the interview, they asked her if you could have anything you wanted to right now, what would you want? She said, actually, I'd like a beer. And then she said, the minute she said that, she wished she could take the words back. One, because it was a flippant response. Two, I don't even like beer, she said. And so, that started her on this quest to. So the book is very, very interesting because you think of these just as, like one of the surgeons says, just a damn pump. That's all it is, And she said, well, you don't know. You haven't had the experience of having that put into your body. It's not just a pump. It brings a lot of cellular memory with it. And so her quest then was to try to find out who the donor was, which isn't easy to do, but she finally tracked down the donor, a young 20s male that was killed in a motorcycle accident. And so, there was the whole food part of it and the cellular memory. Her preferences broadened out, as you were saying, to like things that she never liked before. Green peppers comes to mind. I remember she's saying, the first time she could drive, she was driving down the road. Her car nearly steered itself off the road when she passed the Chicken McNugget's place. But it just gets you so realizing the deep levels of conditioning that take place. And that's that feedback then, and that's why I like to say it's certainly the microbiome needs to get fed. It's important and it's feeding back, but it's about more than, we're not just a microbiome. I kind of railed against that my whole career. From the minute I got involved in ruminant nutrition, the whole universe was the rumen and its microbes, that was it. And it's like, there's more hook to this creature than just a rumen and its microbes. And that's not to say it's not important, but to broaden out. And what Claire experienced really helps to make that point in such powerful and interesting ways. I should probably go back and reread her book. It was fascinating to see how it affected many, many facets. I'm so happy that you brought that up, actually, because all this keeps taking us below the surface, getting to some of the deeper things that go on that are really pretty amazing to consider.
Yeah, and I hate to bring a negative spin to it, but I think that it's pretty clear that we have broken this each leg of the stool, kind of. We've hijacked each of those legs, and we kind of get to this question of like, where do we go now? Are we like, can we gain this nutritional wisdom back? Can we return to some of these insights? I'm going to bring up just two passages that I like loved from your book that kind of bring this question in perspective. So you mentioned we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And then further, when organic chemists synthesize compounds in labs, we consider that an act of high intelligence, as any student who has taken a class in organic chemistry will attest. Yet, plants routinely outmaneuver clever chemists, agribusinesses, and farm folks who attempt to eradicate them with chemicals, as over 500 herbicide-resistant plants. And so I think it kind of gets to this like general idea that humans are somehow superior and are above nature, and we can solve all of our problems with technology, including all of these agrochemicals and these plant-based man-made burgers and things like that. So what's your opinion on how we should move forward?
Well, it's really a good question, Ashley. And, I think the first quote that you read was from Aldo Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, which was written, roughly 75 years ago. And he was very much thinking about these things, our detachment from nature, and what that's, I often chuckle when I think of Aldo. If he thought it was bad back in the late 40s, early 50s, he probably had an intuition where it was going, but I don't think he could have ever imagined where the whole thing would end up. And there's another quote that I like to use of his, and it'll lead us into some conversation about this. He says, there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of thinking that food comes from the grocer, the other that heat comes from the furnace. To avoid the first danger, one should plant a garden, hopefully where there's no grocer to confuse the issue. To avoid the second, one should put a oak on the andirons and let it warm your shins during, a February blizzard tosses the trees outside. He really got it. And that book, A Sand County Almanac, is just deeply moving because he was so appreciative of that we are members of nature's community. How what we do to them, we do to ourselves. And only by nurturing them can we nurture ourselves is really the idea. And we do that by declaring love, not war, I think, on one another and the communities we inhabit. So how to do that? I think one of the things that strikes me that every person could do is simply plant a garden. Plant a garden. Just all the lawn and all the expense we put into watering and fertilizing and spraying with herbicides or creating herbicide-resistant dandelions and so forth. Take some of that lawn, let it be invaded by clovers and stuff, so you don't have to fertilize it. Clovers will keep it really green. Break out some of that lawn and put in some vegetable gardens, maybe even a few herbal garden. Raise your own herbs. Herbs and spices are so good for our health. Then you could even plant medicinal gardens. That there's some really neat folks that just say, here's 20 medicinal plants that you could. And pharmacy came out of that. I have a great friend, Mary Boardman, who was a pharmacist for her career. And we were in Ireland with our spouses a few years back. Unfortunately, her husband has passed since then. Jim, they're in mid to late 80s now. But we were going to these castles, and there was a place where they had their medicinal gardens out there. Oh, did we have fun looking at all the medicinal plants. And she said, when I took pharmacy, we had to know all these different kind of plants because everybody knew that's where the medicines came from. And certainly we were doing extractions and purifications and all that stuff. But she said, now it's all so synthetic. And I'll tell you, sometimes it's interesting to talk to old people that have done something for a lifetime, because you come to realize all the warts and wrinkles and all, you realize all the weaknesses of what you've studied and done and been involved in. You realize we don't know much at all. And she's become very skeptical of pharmaceutical industry and pharmacy, and medicines. It's more this idea, let food be our medicine. That's how to do that. But it's a very challenging question that you ask. How do we try to get people back onto wholesome foods? I think of a medical doctor I work with, John Madney, and a dietitian, Sarah Keogh, that's their whole focus, is how do I work with individuals, and when you're already diabetic and in poor shape, that starts to limit your choices in terms of foods as well. What might be a wholesome diet for some, maybe you can't even be because of the way that you are now, you really have to restrict what you can eat. And so they face a lot of challenges. And then there's the challenge too, that, well, I've always eaten this stuff, and this is what we eat. This is what Italians eat. And I'm not going to, don't try to talk to me about it changing. And so it's a huge challenge. No question about it. I don't pretend to, but I will say that they have success. They do get people to change their diets, and to get feeling better. The way that they just feel so much more energy, so much healthier. And then trying to get people back in tune with their body and what it even feels like to be healthy again. Because it happens in increments, right? And if it starts in the womb, we don't even have much. I'm just thankful that I grew up when I did. It's through no fault of your own, a lot of this, right? I mean, sins of the fathers and the mothers, so to speak, come to get us. But I think a first step, it's like what you're doing, actually try to raise awareness, huh? And I think there is at least some growing awareness that we have totally detached ourselves from the landscapes, going back to your quote, that we inhabit. And then we've come to have diets that are so fundamental to our health, and to so costly nowadays too. I was reading an article about the costs of that for people that are obese, are overweight or obese, the cost to all of us. So at least it's raising, first to start to raise an awareness. If this wisdom were understood and appreciated, and if we had wholesome foods available like Claire offered her kids, there really isn't any need for nutritional guidelines. I mean, we can have them, but it's not to throw out a whole, but it's just to say, and he understood that in his book Biochemical Individuality, that the body knows. The body knows. It has to know, because there never were historically nutritionists and pharmacists and all those kind of things. So
yeah, I think I really like your kind of two big take-home points. It really does come down to the individual. We are going to see change with changes at each individual. And I like your two take-home points of one, starting a garden. I have written down here that Americans spend on average 30 billion on lawn care. We use 3 million tons of fertilizer, and we use more than 30,000 tons of synthetic pesticides that cost us more than 2 billion. So that could be one thing, is like move more people towards turning their lawn into a vegetable garden. So that could be an interesting, like, individual by individual choice. And then going back to just like whole food choices. And I know that that's a challenge with how fast paced everyone is these days in 2021, the modern era of like, I don't have time to make food. I've got to have these fast and convenient. And so there's some school of thought that, hey, we're too far past our previous lifestyles of our ancestors. We're too far past that. And so we have to learn how to adapt in this modern age. And I don't know, that's an interesting question moving forward, is like, are we too far gone? And do we have to kind of restructure something such that we can still tune into this nutritional wisdom that we do have as a human and animal species in this current modern era where we're manifested with 5G, Wi-Fi, cell phones, laptops, distractions, trying to do 12 million things. So like, I don't think any of that's going away. And so we come to this question of how do we blend modern era, but also maintaining that nutritional wisdom. Clearly, something we're doing isn't working. We are the only developed nation that has a decline in our healthy life expectancy. So it's very clear what we're doing now isn't working. And so what is the path moving forward? Is it a full return to what we used to do? I don't think that that's realistic. How do we then blend these nutritional wisdoms, these three stools, three legs on the stool? How do we blend those with the current modern era?
Oh, it's perfect. And I was telling my wife Sue some of those things the other day and saying, it's just so fast paced. Everybody's going. And she said, you know what? That's not right. She said, think about the last 20 years that we were in Utah. You were working 24/7, flat out. I was working too. Yet we had a place. We were fortunate to have. We had 2.3 acres that we got really inexpensively. We could irrigate it. We had wonderful pasture. We raised a steer and 2 lambs, and we raised huge gardens. And Sue took the lead role, but she said, no, I don't buy that. She said, we were working flat out, both of us, and we did all of that stuff. It's where are your priorities? Where do you, and then, we mentioned the gardens and that stuff. And of course you get the reward from simply growing and watching those plants and realizing that they're conscious and sentient and that they're, if you get into that literature, that's a whole. But then you get what you get's the wonderful flavored foods, right? And Sue used to put up, we'd grow every kind of thing under the sun. In Utah, we could grow watermelons and cantaloupes. We could grow corn and all the different green kind of vegetables, raspberries. It is possible to do those things. She's right, but it's a question of priorities. And if that's not something for Sue and I, it always did matter. When we met, I was working on a ranch in Colorado, and we loved that life. We loved working with animals, and we started growing gardens together back then. I don't even know. We just thought it was a neat thing. All the old people did it, and we thought it was kind of a neat thing, and we did that our whole life. So it's kind of learning to do that, and you can start small, but I think it is possible. Probably it's just a question of priorities. I think of my friends in New Zealand too, have 3 wonderful little children, and boy, they're involved in all of that, and they're involved in the slaughtering of animals and realizing, that all life is sacred, basically, plants and animals, all of that, and that it's one of the ironies of being on this planet. Things have to eat other things, right? They all eat other, and whether it's a plant or an animal, in that We Are the Earth paper, we really tried to point out that these plants, they have 20 senses. There's books being written now by researchers who have spent their life studying plant intelligence and behavior and consciousness and sentience. And so, it's the irony of life, but one can participate out of the recognition that it's all sacred, and you treat it that way, right? You treat it with love and respect. And then you realize that, of course, in the indigenous peoples, the parts of the myths and rituals were tied in with that recognition of their interdependence on all the other life, and we're a part of that.
Yeah, it seems like we're at this really important critical stage in human species, and making the current decisions that we are now, we're heading towards a path of extinction. And I think that there's one of the most important legs on this stool is the wisdom that we pass on to the next generation. So the current generation, we have these big decisions and changes that have to be made on the individual level. And then those type of ideologies and changes that we make can then be passed down to the next generation. And so I think it really, like, just going back to what we were saying, involves individual choices, spreading awareness, and then passing that information on to the next generation. Otherwise, I don't know, our species are, but I would love to do another conversation with you, kind of about that idea, because you talk about that a lot in your paper. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my,
Well, for another time, we can
yeah,
do that. Ashley,
yeah,
we can do that. And it is, you know, Sue and I, my wife Sue and I, we're getting older now, and we think back to the old people. We always really liked old people. There's a wisdom that, and I'm not saying it's in us, but there's a wisdom that we always appreciated in the old people. Many of them, they'd never even gone to school, grade school, as far as they back in those days. Their knowledge came to their brains through their hands and their life experience, and we always liked them. And so, they were always thinking and say, oh, everything's gone to the dogs now, it's all. And so I sometimes think, well, maybe it's just because we're getting old, but I really, it does seem like the challenges nowadays, ecologically, economically, socially, are really huge. And there's so many of us on the planet, on this tiny little beautiful blue orb. And unless we can somehow learn to transcend the differences and think that our strength is in trying to learn how to work together, create ecological economies in a sense that we talked in that paper. And I often think, and I know this is naive, and you saw in the last of that paper where we're talking about how naive some of this is, but if we spent all the money we spend on preparing to defend ourselves and on declaring war to help one another out, oh my gosh, the thing would transform. And if we did that out of kind and gentle hearts that weren't just focused on the individual and kind of the selfish aspect of it, but doing for others, it's amazing what could be done. But we put the reality check in at the end of the Earth paper too, or the end of the Earth. We are the Earth paper. That that's nice to think of that, but the fact is that we're a warring species. It's all we've ever done: declare war on one another, and then we brought in those Hindu beliefs that this isn't going to rival whatever your view is of the next life of heaven. It's not the point of Earth. So we're trying to be a little bit realistic at the end of that. But put in, we realize some of those thoughts are naive, but like that John Lennon song, Imagine, huh? He could imagine.
yeah. A little preview into our next conversation. Okay, so I have taken up too much of your time today, but I do like to end my interviews with a similar type of question. So my sister and I are really big advocates of nose to tail eating. So we like to honor and respect the entire animal, zero waste, let no part of the animal go to waste. And oftentimes these off parts are some of the most nutritious. So if Fred could choose any animal and any part of that animal, what would be your favorite cut?
Oh, that's a good question. Depending on how it's prepared, I like all of the animals. What popped into my mind was grouse. I used to love to hunt blue grouse. And we used to, I don't know if we quite ate nose to beak to tail feathers on the grouse, but it was delicious. And the rabbits that we used to hunt back in the day, where we do the same thing and make stews that were prepared all day long with all of the different parts of the animal. It came to mind too when you said that. We used to, when I was working on the ranch in the fall of the year, we used to butcher hogs. Not many, it's just for our own personal use. But there was, the killing of the animal, and then we had this big cauldron, and you'd each stand on the side, and there was a fire underneath it. So the water was hot, and you'd have chains, and you'd soak the hog in there, and then you'd flip it with the change. You'd roll it over so it gets soak on one side, soak on. Why do you do that? Then you'd roll it out. It's a technique to all of this I was learning. And then you scrape the hog, scrape all the hair off the hide, and then you gut it and save all the organs. And Henry DeLuca used to say, the only thing gets away is the squeal.
Yeah.
So for way back in the day, that's the only thing that gets lost is the squeal.
Yeah. Because I personally think that like full animal utilization, full carcass utilization should be a big thing that we adopt at a larger scale, because eating animals is not going away. It shouldn't. It's very nutritious. But you mentioned either it was you or Dr. Stefan von Vliet in one of the papers recently about how there's a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emission on an individual by individual basis when they consume the organs and off parts. And so I think that we're trying to spread awareness about like nose to tail eating, because I think that we're all adjusted in the modern age in America to just consume ribeyes and tenderloins. But we could be a lot more resourceful with animals and kind of consume everything. So one of my favorite parts is the cheeks of beef or pork. When that's cooked low and slow, it's got this like great blend of muscle meat and connective tissue. So, and then of course I like all the organs. I'm a big liver eater, so.
And as you point out, when you look at the nutritional characteristics of those organs, they're incredibly nutrient rich, dense and rich. Yeah, absolutely. And
I think it's
honoring the entire animal in that sense too, huh?
Yeah.
Of utilizing and honoring the entire animal.
The day that we get consuming organs in the dietary guidelines from the government is a day that we will prevail slightly.
Yeah, well, Ashley, you keep working at that in terms of what you're doing. We all will, huh? And we made that point in one of those papers about one of the papers with Stefan about that very point, huh? Yeah, and for people who aren't accustomed to eating some of those organs, one is learning how to make that familiar to you, right? And Stefan talks about, well, one way is to start to mix a little bit of liver in with ground beef, right? To condition a preference, right?
It goes back to that feedback.
Yes, it does. It absolutely, absolutely does. It absolutely does, to get your palate in tune with what that can provide you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Provenza. I think that this was really insightful, and I hope people can have some takeaway points. I'd love to get you back on. I have like a few other pages of notes that I have from your book and your papers to talk about some what I think are really important problems and issues that we face at a really large scale. And like I said, I really appreciate your insights that you've gathered from your 40 or so years of research evaluating animals and then the correlations that we see with humans. So thank you so much for your time. And we'd love to have you back on if you're willing to do so.
Actually, just in closing, let me say to thank you for having me on. I'd be delighted to be on again. And I say this from the depths of my being. You did such a great job on this interview and of doing your homework. It's just so obvious from the questions you ask and all the materials you had prepared to answer those questions yourself. Actually, you did a wonderful job. No kidding.
Well, thank you. I really enjoy reading this type of information. I find it like really fascinating. I think it's really in line with my sister and I's goal of improving the health of humans and improving the health of our land. And so thank you for all of the work you've published about it. I will continue to read it. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome, Ashley. And thank you for what you're doing to try to get the word out.
Thank you. All right, thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I am so appreciative of the time that Dr. Provenza was able to provide coming onto this channel to talk about these really interesting and important topics. After our call, I went out and just watched the chickens for a little bit. And it's amazing how I'll fill up their bins with feed and they'll come and they'll munch on the feed, but then they'll at some point just decide enough is enough and they'll leave the coop and go out into the wooded area and go forage for insects and bugs. And so they have this like innate wisdom of, okay, that was enough of the feed and now it's time for me to go do other things, other activities, and explore this landscape around me. One thing that I did not get the opportunity to talk about with Dr. Provenza is this idea of whether or not we should fully follow the nutritional wisdom of our ancestors and whether we have to slightly modify what our ancestors used to do in the current modern era, because we experience a lot more stressors in our current life relative to what our ancestors experienced, such as toxins in our food, environmental stressors, Wi-Fi, 5G, trying to do 10 things in life. And so that's an interesting question. And that's something that the bioenergetic, the Reiki community talks about. And so hopefully Dr. Provenza and I can talk about this topic a little bit more in a future video. However, I do think that it's always important to consider bioindividuality. We all are unique and different. We come from different pasts. We have different gut microbiomes, different levels of bacteria. We're all experiencing different temperatures, climates, environments, stressors each day relative to one another. And so there's no one size fits all. And I really think an important thing is learning to tune back into our bodies to kind of discover more about what we need at any given point in time. So, as an example, Dr. Provenza talked about how cows on the pasture are given this like mineral pool, so different tubs of different minerals, and they just have this ability to go to the tub that they need and munch on that mineral until they're satisfied. And I feel like a lot of us have lost touch with that and what the main source of the problem, why we don't have that innate nutritional wisdom. I'm not sure. Maybe all of the like mass information that we're all exposed to, we're always second guessing our decisions, we're all confused with all the conflicting information. However, we do know one thing: the current approach that we're taking isn't necessarily working that well. We're the only developed nation with a decrease in our healthy life expectancy. So what we're doing now isn't working. And I think this disattachment from nature could be one of the main reasons we are trying to outsmart nature with these technologies, the way that our farming and agricultural practices are leading to nutrient depleted foods. And so there's a whole host of issues with how we're making and producing food as well. That could be one of the main reasons why we've lost touch with our own nutritional wisdom. So I hope you guys took away some good points from today's video. I look forward to talking more about these topics in the future. And until next time, make sure you are behaving like an angel.